Hi there. Welcome to my talk at the JetBrains Plugin Developers Conference, Experiences Building a Language Server Protocol Plugin. In this talk, I'm going to be showing you a plugin I've been working on called Contextive. This is actually a multi-IDE extension, and I'm going to talk to you about how I've been building this for the IntelliJ platform using the new language server protocol support. Give you a little bit of a background about myself. My name is Chris. My background is as a software developer, but also as a technical leader. I was a co-founding CTO of a couple of startups here in Australia. One of those startups, we sold it, and the other one is still operating. And these days, I work as a consultant, a coach for startup CTOs, a trainer and an advisor and a consultant in domain-driven design. And I work a lot in the community, organizing meetups, speaking at conferences, and developing open source like this plugin that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So, as I said, the plugin is called Contextive. And before we get into how we build language server protocol plugins, I'm going to just give you a bit of a background into what this plugin is and what it does and why I built it. If you're familiar with domain-driven design, you might be familiar with some of these ideas, but just in case you're not, there's some pretty fundamental human communication things happening when we build software. And I'm sure all of us have been in a situation where our business counterparts have been using terminology and language. For example, they might say something like when the order is placed. And then as developers, we often like to abstract things and make them quite generic. And so you can imagine that someone might then have write a class in their code called entity with a method create. But then as developers, sometimes when we're talking about what's happening in our systems, we might use different language yet again and talk about things like when the database record is inserted. Now, all three of these situations, we're actually kind of talking about the same thing, but we're using very different languages. Now, in domain-driven design, one of the important ideas is a thing called ubiquitous language. And what this tells us is that we should try and use the same language in all the places that we can. And the language that we should use is the language of the domain. It's the language that our domain experts, our business stakeholders use. So, for example, if our business stakeholders were to say when the order is placed, ideally our code would use the word order and the word place in the method. And as developers, when we're talking about what's happening in the system, we would also use that kind of language when the order is placed. And this is something that can be incredibly valuable, both for communication with our business counterparts to make sure that we are building the right thing and that they understand what we're building, but also to make sure that our software design aligns with the domain, which generally speaking helps make it more maintainable and easier to understand for other developers when they join our teams and start working on our code. But today I'm not here to talk to you too much about domain-driven design. It is a fascinating topic, and I do love talking about it, but that's for another time. But for this talk, we're talking about the Contextive extension. And the reason I built this was to help developers make better use of the ubiquitous language. So if you install this extension and you configure the terminology that's relevant in your domain, you can get some really helpful things happening in your IDE. For example, if we were to create a class called order, and we could document it, then we could get a tooltip like this saying ordering context with a vision of the context. That's the subsystem that we're working in at the moment, and the terminology, the word order, which in this case means a purchase of a set of items from the catalog. We can also set up some usage examples, like for example, saying the customer has placed the order or we haven't yet shipped the order. These usage examples can be incredibly powerful for helping developers understand the meaning of these words in a specific context for a given domain. Uh, that's been just a brief screenshot of what it looks like, but I actually wanted to show you briefly what it looks like to actually work with this tool in the IDE. So, for example, we set up our definitions using a YAML file here. We can define multiple contexts in the YAML file. In domain-driven design terms, we would call that a bounded context, but don't worry too much about that at the moment. And we can set up a number of terms. Each term is a special word in this domain. So let's say, for example, we were working in a domain that had the word settlement that means something. I was recently working in a domain that used the word settlement to represent a financial transaction. If we set up our YAML file like this, then if I hover over the word settlement, we can see that we have it specified here, but it's currently undefined. So let's give it a definition and say the transfer of funds from purchaser to vendor. And now if I hover over this word, you'll see the definition there. You'll see that I'm getting this definition even when I hover it over it in the YAML file. If I create a, um, a class, for example, um, I'll also get the definition here because we're trying to represent the ubiquitous language, the domain terminology. So this is actually code agnostic in the way that it looks for these words. It works in Java, it works in Kotlin, it works in JavaScript or TypeScript, even in Markdown files, or as you saw before, um, in the YAML file itself in which we have the definition. We can do some other neat things, like we can have aliases. Um, like for example, maybe historically, instead of the word settlement, they used to use the word transfer. And now if we hover over the word transfer, we'll see that there is a settlement, but also there's some aliases to the word transfer. So that can help us if we're evolving our language over time in our domains. And we can also set up some examples like the settlement is due to take place on the 1st of December. So that's a real sentence that could actually be said by a domain expert about this. And now when we're working in the code, even in this file here, we'll get this definition. So we get the definition of the term and also the usage examples. Now, my hope in building this was that it would really help developers immerse themselves in the languages that their domain experts use. And quite a lot of people are using this tool now and are reporting that it is actually helping them with that. Not to mention that by storing the definitions in the YAML file in the repository, you can track changes to these terms over time, and you can see any changes in pull requests, for example, and it can really help make sure that everyone really understands what's happening in the domain as they're working on this code. So that's been a little demo of how the tool works. But actually, what we're here to talk about tonight, because this is the plugin developers conference, is actually how we built this extension, how we built this plugin in the IntelliJ platform. And this one actually uses a fairly new feature of the IntelliJ platform, which is support for the language server protocol. I'm just going to briefly talk about what the language server protocol is. If you can imagine, we have our IntelliJ IDE, and I've built this plugin Contextive. So there's some kind of connection between IntelliJ and Contextive, and Contextive obviously is able to provide the hover definitions that you saw there before. But since I'm building Contextive to work across multiple code files, I want it to work in as many IDEs as possible. Um, in fact, I want it to work in IntelliJ, I want it to work in VS Code, I want it to work in NeoVim, Visual Studio, in pretty much any IDE where someone might want to get these definitions. I'd like Contextive to be able to work. And this is actually what the language server protocol was built to support. It was built to support people who are developing language features. Not usually, or I don't think it was expected to be used the way I'm using it for human language or ubiquitous language. But say, for example, you design a new programming language and you want to build support for that programming language into your users' favorite IDEs, the language server protocol can help you. And so just by building one component, which we call a language server, any IDE that supports the language server protocol can integrate with your language server and provide common language support for it in that IDE. A common interaction pattern, say for example, if you were to use the capability to go to a definition, as we often do, if you're referencing a class, for example, this is straight from the language server protocol specification. When the user opens the document, the IDE will send a notification to the language server called text document did open. When the user edits the document, there's another notification sent saying text document did change. The language server can send back diagnostics, for example, like warnings or errors that it finds in the code, and that can get surfaced up to the user in the IDE specific way. Um, the user can say go to definition, which will issue a request to the language server. The language server can respond with the details of that definition and the location, and then the user closes the document and we get the did close notification. So you can see there's a mixture of notifications, which are sort of one-way messages, and requests, which involve a message and then a response. And this specification of the language server protocol defines everything to do with all of these things, all of the notifications and requests that are available, and the parameters that are available as they get sent back and forth between the IDE and the language server. To give you an example of exactly what's happening when Contextive is providing that tooltip support, we have a text document hover request that is sent from the IDE down to Contextive. It includes a text document field that specifies what file the user is currently hovering over, and the position of their hover with a line and character specification. So on the first line of the file in the 15th character, or maybe the 16th character, this is where the user's cursor currently is in this file, and it's saying to the language server, what would you like to show in the tooltip, in the definitions? And so the response can be, here are the contents that I'd like you to show. I'm going to be sending Markdown. You don't have to send Markdown. You can send plain text. There's a couple of things that are supported. And then the value might be the Markdown heading for ordering context with a new line and so on. I haven't included the whole definition there, but it gives you a flavor of the kind of JSON messages that are sent back and forth between the IDE and the language server to make it possible for any IDE that supports this protocol to support any language that someone might build a language server for. And it's quite nice as the developer of a language server to be able to build it once and have it work across multiple IDEs. So how do we actually get this language server to work in IntelliJ? How does the IntelliJ LSP support work? This is a fairly new capability. This is a screenshot from the JetBrains documentation site about the language server protocol. It's a great page. It's getting updated all the time. I found it incredibly helpful in building this plugin. There's a bit of detail here on the JetBrains IDEs that are supported. And the target baseline that you must have. So you have to start with IDE. So IntelliJ IDE Ultimate 2023.2. Anything later than that will support it, and they're adding more support for more capabilities from the language server protocol all the time. So every new version, there tends to be one or two new language server protocol features that are supported. This is again exactly from that documentation. This is a bare bones language server protocol plugin. There's a few key elements going on here, but this is really all the code that you have to provide if you already have a language server to make your plugin work in the IntelliJ platform. The first thing is you override this function, which gets executed whenever a file is opened, and it tells you the project and the file that is being opened. If you decide that you want to use your language server for this file, then you call ensure server started on this server starter object that's passed in to ensure the language server is running. The argument to this is a server descriptor, which you define down the bottom here. And the server descriptor has a few methods that you override. The most important one here being to create the command line, which tells it how to start the language server if you need it to. And as you can see here, in this example, it's starting it using standard input output. And those JSON messages are just being passed directly over standard input output pipes. So the very first version of the Contextive plugin for the IntelliJ platform didn't look very different from that. This is actually what it looked like. I copied this out of the GitHub history. It has evolved a lot since then, but this is the first thing that I did to get it started, and was very pleasantly surprised that it worked straight away. So we had the same sorts of things here. We were saying when the file is opened, we're going to ensure the language server is running. To get it started when I was first going, I made the assumption that the language server is available in the global path, so I didn't need to worry about configuring the specific location of it. And I said that it's going to be active in all files, because for my use case, it actually should be active in for all files, because as I said before, it's language agnostic. One of the things that you might imagine then, okay, so we have our IntelliJ IDE, and then we have a language server. We have to actually make sure that we can get the language server to our users when they install the plugin. So there's a couple of options that you can rely on. One is that you can bundle the language server into your plugin, just as like a regular asset, or you can set up a configuration parameter so that the user can configure the location of the language server, which might be useful if maybe you want to publish a plugin to the IntelliJ plugin store, but you don't actually own the language server that's connected to it, and you want to give users the opportunity to configure that location. Both of these are options. But I had an extra challenge with this, which is that my language server is written in a platform-specific language. So it actually compiles a bunch of different binaries, than the different binary for each platform. So you can see here, this is from the GitHub, the most recent release, version 1.12.1. And I've got a binary for OS X x64, binary for OS X ARM64, Linux, two variations there, and Windows. And so I have to make sure that the user has the right language server depending on their platform, which is something that I think obviously most IntelliJ plugins don't have to worry about too much, relying as they do on the JVM. So there's a couple of options, as well as bundling into the plugin and having the user configure the location. I think for a platform-specific language server, we should add the auto download capability so that users don't have to worry about finding it, but also we don't have to bundle all the platforms into the plugin. I think that would be a huge waste of space, and it's probably quite complex for users to have to go and fetch the language server themselves and configure its location. So I decided I was going to build into this plugin the ability to automatically download the language server, the correct language server, when the plugin starts up. So the process that we use is sort of illustrated in this flowchart. When the file is opened, we check on the status of the language server. If we couldn't find it, if it's not present on the disk in a standard location, then we execute a download process. And then once the download is completed, then we ensure that the server is started. If the language server has already been downloaded, then we can just make sure it's started straight away. If the language server is in the middle of being downloaded, then we don't need to do anything because the current download process will ensure it's started when that has completed. And as a simple methodology, this one works okay, but it has a bit of a problem, which is that it blocks the user interface. That file opened method is blocking, and so if you immediately start doing a download in that, you'll block the UI until the download is completed. So in order to implement a non-blocking download, we basically move that download capability into a scheduled activity on a pulled thread, which makes sure it can happen in the background. And then there's a few other bits and pieces we need to do to make sure that the thing starts. And so just to give you an example, some of the key code elements to make that possible, um, in the part where the file is downloaded, when the file is opened, we do this thing here. We call the application manager get application execute on pulled thread, which is a non-blocking call. The nice thing here is it actually allows us to switch into a run blocking coroutine, which means that the download method can make use of some of the nice background process reporting capabilities that are available. So, for example, we can set up a reporting context with the title of Contextive and indicating that the user can cancel it. Um, and then we can set up some item steps here and then report on the size. And so the nice thing here is that when you first start up the IDE with the plugin installed, if the language server is not found, then it will download it, but you get a nice little progress indicator down at the bottom of the IDE that you can cancel if you want to, and it shows you how the download is going, depending on obviously your download speeds that are available. One thing to be aware of is that because this is now happening in a pulled thread in the background, we have to use a slightly different technique to make sure that the servers are started after the download is completed, because we no longer have access to that server starter object that's available in the file opened method. But once I got this working, it works incredibly well, and I'm really happy to say that people that have been using it have not had any problems, and it's quite a seamless experience for them to just install the plugin. The first time they use it, it downloads quite quickly, and then it just immediately is working for them. So if you find yourself building a language server protocol plugin and you would like to have platform-specific binaries for your language server, I'm very happy for you to check out the Contextive source code and copy this stuff. It should just work for you in a pretty straightforward way. Um, the next thing that I did in building this plugin was I wanted to make it more testable. Even though I obviously test my language server quite extensively, now that I've built this automatic download capability, there's some complex logic going on, and I wanted to make sure that I could test that. So I ended up refactoring it into a more composable structure. I set up a class called a Contextive Manager, which is the one that sort of handles most of the rules of the language server downloading, and then a language server download scheduler, which takes care of executing on the pulled thread. And I split out a few of key elements. So there's a location resolver, which works out the URL of the correct language server to download by inspecting the platform that we're on and the version of the plugin. Then a downloader, which actually does the download and unzip of the plugin. There's a file system abstraction that allows us to test the download scheduler by mocking the file system, and an LSP manager abstraction that allows us to mock the starting of the language server once the download is completed. So by decomposing into these elements, it made it quite easy for me to set up some pretty nice unit tests here. So you can see here the language server download scheduler test. I don't think we've got time to go into all the nitty-gritty elements of the code here, but just to show you the key components here, there's some tests like given already downloaded, it should call back immediately, and given not yet downloaded, it should call back after downloading, and given mid-download, it should do nothing. So that kind of represents those key outcomes from that flowchart that I showed you earlier. Whereas the Contextive Manager as some tests, like given the contextive file presence, ensure started if is present. This is something that I forgot to mention earlier, is that whilst this extension does work in all files, it should only be active if there's a YAML configuration file found. If we don't find such a configuration file with any definitions, then there's no point starting the language server. And so there's a few tests here to make sure that we only start the language server if that configuration file is actually found. So getting pretty close to the end of the talk here, sort of showing you the key elements in building a language server protocol plugin, and the journey that I've gone on in building this plugin. But I wanted to wrap up with a couple of suggestions and my personal wish list for the future of language server protocol support in the JetBrains IDEs. Now, my first tip, and really it's my only tip, is definitely join the plugin developer Slack. I joined this when I started working on this plugin, and it's been incredibly helpful. It's a very active community on there. And I want to have a special shout out to Alexander Doroshko, who's been an incredible support. Every time I've asked a question on the Slack, he's responded very quickly, and has reviewed my code and given me some great suggestions for improving this plugin. So huge thanks there. And I think you'll find that pretty much all of the team that monitor the Slack provide the same level of support to plugin developers. So great job, everybody there. And if you are working on a plugin, definitely join the Slack. You don't want to be missing out on that. In terms of the actual language server protocol support, there's a couple of things that I would like to sort of suggest that would be helpful for me personally. One is that once you activate a language server at the moment, it kind of takes over the native capabilities. So, for example, if I had an order class, but I did not have my Contextive plugin installed, then as you would imagine, I'm going to get the um, definitely the information tooltip here with public class order, and the domain model for order coming from the Java doc comment up the top there. And that's quite helpful, and we should still have that. Because even though Contextive provides definitions of the domain terminology, it doesn't document your code. So you're probably still going to have Java doc comments that describe the class, or the classes that you're using, which is separate from the domain terminology definitions, which Contextive is trying to provide. However, at the moment, because the language server is kind of assumed to be taking over support for the file that's been opened, what ends up happening after Contextive is installed is that it replaces the whole definitions panel. So my wish list is that we actually can merge those two, and we can see both the native support as well as anything coming from any language servers that are active. The next thing that would be really nice is if it supported an automatic downloader, so that I didn't have to go and build the one that I built. I'll be honest, it was quite a lot of fun building it, but it's always nice when the platforms take care of these things for you. And I do think this is something that a lot of language server protocol plugin developers are going to find helpful. So if there was a sort of a built-in download capability, that would probably be quite nice. And if there was one, I'd be very happy to retire mine and make use of the platform's capability. Um, Next thing would be a sort of a coroutine friendly API. As you saw, I had to execute on a pulled thread in order to switch into a run blocking coroutine. So if some of the APIs that we're hooking into, those sort of methods that are being overridden, that would be quite nice if we could sort of hook into that in a coroutine friendly way, if you're building in Kotlin, of course. And then the last one is that even though all of the JetBrains IDEs are supported with the language server protocol, as you saw back on an earlier slide, Rider does have some unique elements to it because of the architecture of how it delegates out to, effectively the sort of resharper capability within Rider for .NET support. If you open a solution in Rider, the language server protocol plugins don't seem to work particularly well. And I think this is probably related to that first point about making sure that the native and language server protocol support can work side by side. I do understand that this is going to be not necessarily something that's going to happen in a hurry, but just sort of noting it there that it'd be quite nice for me and my users. So that's the end of my talk here today, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that if you didn't know anything about domain-driven design or the ubiquitous language, that you found that interesting. And if you weren't familiar with the language server protocol, that's also been something that is interesting for you. And if you do decide that you would like to build a language server protocol plugin, please feel free to connect with me. There's a few websites there and social media handles. You can also access these slides on that QR code. I'd be very happy to chat with anybody, both during a Q&A right now, I guess, or online later at any time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to JetBrains for having me.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was very insightful talk, I guess, and the feedback from the chat already proves that. So now we can go to some of the questions that have been asked during your talk. The first one, I guess, is pretty easy to answer. Is this plugin open source?
Yes, it is. So it's on GitHub. If you search for Contextive, or just go to contextive.tech, that'll redirect you to the GitHub. You can see all the source code there. Hopefully, you'll see that most of the source code is for the language server, and then I've got special folders for the plugins to be deployed to the various plugin and extension stores for different IDEs.
Yeah.
All open source.
That's actually a nice transition to the next question. Does it mean that you can develop an LSP using IntelliJ and use it in other LSP-compatible platforms? I think that's a bit maybe of a slight misunderstanding in this question. How would you answer it?
Yeah, so the way I explain it is yes-ish. So you can develop a language server, and you can test that language server using the IntelliJ support for the language server protocol. And then you can use that language server in other LSP compatible platforms. But the plugin that you develop for the IntelliJ platform is obviously only going to work in the IntelliJ platform IDE.
Exactly.
So you just need to be very clear about the distinction between the plugin and the language server. The language server is reusable, the plugin is not.
Yeah. We have another question about LSP, and our colleague Alexander already answered that to me in a private DM. And thanks again, Chris, also for your shout out. Very much appreciated. Can LSP be used to add new features to an already existing language, like PHP, for example? And the answer is, in general, yes, but it depends a bit on the use cases, and there might be slight nuances. Maybe, Chris, you have some of your experiences to add here, because I mean, you are technically doing something similar, right?
That's right. Yeah. So my experience is, I would echo Alexander's comments there, is that it does depend. You need to try the thing that you want to do. My experience, as I sort of highlighted in the tips or in the wish list section of my talk, is that there are some instances where the LSP feature will replace the native support. So if that's what you need for PHP, if you want to replace existing feature support, that might work quite well for you. If you want it to work side by side with it, it'll probably depend on the specific LSP capability that you're using. Which I probably should draw attention to is that I focused a lot on the hover capability because that's the one that I use the most. But if you look at the LSP specification, there are dozens of capabilities that the LSP can offer. And this is maybe relevant also for the previous question, is that the JetBrains LSP support is pretty new. It's expanding rapidly. I've been really impressed with the team and how quickly they're adding new capabilities to it, but I don't think that they would say that it's 100% compliant with the spec. It doesn't offer all of the features that the spec advertises. So if you want to use some of those features that are not yet present in the JetBrains platform, you don't yet have access to that. But I think I'm reasonably confident from what I've seen that it won't take long before it's a very broadly supported specification. I would say that they've done a really good job of choosing the most important ones first, certainly the ones that suited me. So I think that's been sort of well prioritized by the team.
Yeah. Let me add that, of course, if you are actively researching into building an LSP plugin, as Chris already mentioned, we are very much reachable and listening to the people who try to build something on that. So please share your feedback, your complaints, your feature requests for everything around LSP, and Alexander will definitely be stepping in and help you as quickly as possible. He's really great in doing that. So thanks to Alexander from my side as well, for answering all the LSP questions that our team gets. And in fact, I've just yesterday, updated the LSP page once again with a few more features, new endpoints supported. So yeah, it's worth keeping an eye on that as well. What's going on?
Mm-hmm.
We have more of a technical question. Is this communication between the LSP server and the IDE, isn't it slow, or is there anything you can say from your experience, Chris? Because to be honest, I personally haven't been using LSP plugins myself yet. I simply didn't need them. So what's your experience?
So the communication itself, I don't think is particularly slow. Yes, it's JSON over some sort of pipe. You have to remember this is usually a local communication with a locally running server. So you don't have sort of network delays and other things going on. I guess in theory you could run it over a network, but I don't think that's usually the pattern that people are doing. So the communication itself is quite fast. In terms of the amount of data being transmitted, and whether the LSP is sort of loading files from disk every time, or if it's open keeping them in memory, that's really an implementation question. My plugin does keep them in memory. The other thing to be aware of is that usually the copy of the file that you want to be working with is not necessarily on disk, because you need to be analyzing and returning results for a currently unsaved copy of the file while the user is editing that file. So the language server protocol supports that by having the contents of the file passed to the backend, to the language server over the protocol, and it supports both like full file contents and diff-based transfers. So you can get updates just like for the changes that the user has made. And the intention usually is to keep that in memory so that you can analyze and return results in relation to what the user is currently editing, even if they haven't actually saved the file. So that kind of speaks to, I think, the question that the person is asking around storing files in memory and why that actually is the case that you do that. It's not just a performance reason, it's like a functional reason, because the files aren't actually on disk yet. So you have to get them from the IDE via the protocol.
Right.
But I think the net result of that is that usually the performance is fine. Although, as I'm sure many of us have seen, if you want to make it slow, you probably can, and you might do that by accident if you are, making some mistakes in your code. But certainly, the protocol itself doesn't force it to be slow, and there's plenty of plugins that work very efficiently and effectively using this in multiple IDEs.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing this field experience with us, and this will hopefully also encourage other people to look into LSP as one of the options you have for supporting features in IntelliJ and many other IDEs. But that way, let me add one small note. It is perfectly possible to add some IntelliJ specific features in your IntelliJ plugin, right? So technically, an LSP plugin for an IDE can, to some degree, be customized or add some additional features on top of what the LSP server provides.
Absolutely.
So if there is some things that are easier to do, maybe using the IntelliJ platform API, then that's perfectly doable. Or if, for example, the LSP API that the IntelliJ platform provides currently does not offer all the features that you need, you might find an alternative way to just use the IntelliJ platform APIs as some kind of bridged attempt. Yeah.
And I think actually there will be a common use case where you continue to do that even as the LSP support continues, which is, for example, if you want to add items to the menu or buttons to the button bar. I think particularly for things like configuration windows, they're very likely to always use JetBrains specific plugin APIs. And then if you want to, the LSP actually supports extension via custom commands. And so you can add a menu option that will be linked to sending a custom command to your language server. So there'll be a combination of JetBrains specific plugin elements to extend the UI, and then potentially some language server support. I think it's going to be really common for language server protocol plugins to utilize that for, say, configuration windows, if they're going to use that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that's a really good call out, that at the end of the day, it's just a regular JetBrains plugin that just happens to invoke an external language server for some features and then hook into the right APIs so that that language server is used by the language server support in the platform.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I think Chris is a bit lagging, but at least I was able to understand your answer. So thank you very much for your insights here once again. Then we have a difficult question. Any plans for allowing LSP in the community editions in the future? To be honest, I have no insights on that at the moment. I know that this is a common question because currently the LSP support is indeed only supported in the paid IDEs, which is obviously a decision that we have made in JetBrains. And
the paid IDEs became free to some degree.
To some degree, yes. So that's actually an improvement since recently. So yeah, there are more IDEs now which you can target without actually paying for the IDE. But yes, this is a current limitation, and I have no insights that I could share at this moment if we have any plans for doing this.
Okay, do we have no other questions right now?
I don't see any
No.
LSP questions.
Maybe we could ask some question to the audience right now.
Yes, let's run another referral question quickly before the next talk. Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation.
Sorry.
Have a great evening, and thanks for your time and dedication to build such an interesting plugin for the IntelliJ plugins as well.
Oh, thank you so much, and thanks for having me. Enjoy the rest of the conference.